The elephant's birth was already a rare event. Twin calves, something few ever witness. But as the newborns touched the ground for the first time, something completely unexpected happened. What appeared next wasn't in any textbook, nor in anyone's plans. And even the most seasoned scientists fell into stunned silence. The morning air at Hidden Grove Wildlife Sanctuary in Central Oregon was still and damp, the kind of calm that feels like the world is holding its breath. Volunteers stood clustered just outside the birthing enclosure, clutching warm mugs and murmuring nervously. Mara, the sanctuary's oldest and most emotionally complex elephant, was in labor. Her breaths were shallow, trunk curled protectively, inward, eyes glistening with something no one could name. Then it happened. Not one calf, but two. The gasps echoed across the enclosure like a ripple in still water. Twin births in elephants are virtually unheard of. Most caretakers go their whole careers without witnessing one. And for a fleeting moment, awe overtook the tension. But that moment was short-lived. As the second calf landed and struggled to its feet, something else stirred in the straw beneath them. At first, no one noticed. Not the interns with their clipboards, nor the camera crew live-streaming the miracle. But Diane Matthews, the sanctuary's director and a former wildlife biologist with 30 years of field experience, felt it. Before she saw it, a chill crept up her spine. One of the calves wasn't just moving, it was listening, and not in the instinctive way a newborn might. This was different, calculated, almost deliberate. Nestled between the pine-covered slopes of Central Oregon's Cascade foothills, the Hidden Grove Wildlife Sanctuary had always felt like a second chance carved into the land. It wasn't just a home for injured or aging animals, it was a retreat for the forgotten, the outcast, and the misunderstood. Founded by a group of retired biologists and conservationists, most of them women who had once broken ceilings in the 70s and 80s, the sanctuary had earned a quiet reputation in scientific circles for doing what government-backed zoos often couldn't, giving dignity to life in its most vulnerable forms. Diane Matthews had been with the sanctuary from the beginning. Now in her late 60s, she wore her silver hair in a simple braid and walked with a slight limp from an old field injury in Botswana. Her hands were always cold, her voice soft but commanding. People listened when Diane spoke, not because she demanded it, but because she knew things, felt things, the kind of instincts that couldn't be taught in grad school or replicated by AI models sifting through animal behavior databases. On the day Mara went into labor, Diane had woken before dawn. She didn't trust sleep on days like this. There were too many variables, too many silent signals only experience could catch. She paced outside the enclosure, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, eyes darting toward the sky where a thick blanket of gray clouds hung, pregnant with rain. Mara had been rescued from a bankrupt roadside zoo in Texas nearly 10 years earlier. She arrived broken, emotionally shut down, reactive, traumatized by chains and loud crowds. It took months just to get her to eat regularly, years before she allowed another elephant near her. Diane had watched her transform from a shell into something whole, strong, and somehow, despite her past, Mara had conceived through a complicated, closely monitored process involving artificial insemination and a long-shot hope. That hope had turned into a miracle. As the calves emerged, the team scrambled. Calls were made to the Oregon Zoo, to the University of Washington's veterinary program, even to a quiet network of former elephant specialists who now worked from home, often underfunded, always passionate. Cameras clicked, videos streamed, and journalists began circling. But inside the enclosure, Diane didn't move toward the calves. She stood motionless, just outside the gate, watching. Not with joy, though there was some of that. Not even with relief. Her gaze was fixed, sharp, unreadable. Something's off. she murmured, barely audible to the young intern beside her. Off? The girl blinked, confusion clouding her face. They're both breathing, both standing. I know, Diane said, but one of them didn't blink when the lights came on. The intern didn't understand, not yet. But Diane did. She felt that subtle pull in her gut, the one that had never failed her in 4 decades of wildlife work. Something about this birth wasn't just rare, it was impossible. The announcement of twin elephant calves born in captivity spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, the Hidden Grove Sanctuary's modest website crashed under the weight of nationwide traffic. News vans staked out along the gravel road leading into the preserve, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, their reporters bracing against drizzle with waterproof microphones in hand. For the first time in its history, Hidden Grove had gone viral. Twin births in elephants occur in less than 1% of pregnancies, and when they do, survival is rare. Most mother elephants reject one calf, or their bodies simply can't support both, but Mara was proving the exception. She remained upright, attentive, surprisingly calm. Volunteers whispered that she looked almost proud, her enormous frame shielding the calves as though she sensed their significance. The 2 newborns, both male, were immediately nicknamed Ash and River by the staff. Ash, the firstborn, was clumsy and vocal, stumbling frequently but always letting out eager, high-pitched squeaks that melted hearts. River, the second, was quieter, observant. His movements were slow, almost cautious, and he rarely made noise. When he did, it was low and drawn out, a sound that vibrated more than echoed. Veterinarians were optimistic. Both calves showed healthy vitals, strong nursing instincts, and no visible deformities. Social media flooded with heart emojis and hashtags. Miracle twins, Mara magic, double blessing. Mothers posted videos of their children watching the live feed, eyes wide in wonder. Yet Diane remained unsettled. During a team meeting 2 days after the birth, she voiced her concerns. River doesn't behave like a newborn, she said plainly. He watches. He chooses when to move, where to stand, who to follow. Ash reacts. River calculates. Some of the younger staff nodded politely, chalking it up to maternal over-observation. Others exchanged glances, but one voice unexpectedly backed Diane. Nia Alvarez, a vet tech in her 50s with 2 decades of wildlife rehabilitation under her belt. I've seen that look before, Nia said, frowning. Not in elephants, in chimpanzees. Ones. Raised in experimental labs. They didn't just look at you, they watched you, waited for patterns. River's eyes had that same stillness, that eerie human-like pause between stimulus and reaction. It wasn't something easily proven, but it was something deeply felt. Meanwhile, a small team from the University of Oregon arrived to begin non-invasive cognitive assessments. They brought thermal imaging, sound frequency analysis, even scent recognition equipment, all in hopes of documenting what could be a revolutionary developmental case. As the technicians set up, River stood just inside the enclosure, his small grey frame half-shadowed under Mara's belly. He wasn't looking at the cameras or the crowd, or even his brother tumbling in the straw. He was staring at Diane. And when she met his eyes again, she felt the same ripple she had felt the morning he was born. Like the earth beneath her, boots had shifted just enough to throw everything out of balance. 3 days had passed since the birth, and while most of the staff at Hidden Grove basked in media attention and public praise, Diane found herself waking in the middle of the night. Heart racing, hands trembling, mind circling one persistent question. What exactly had they witnessed? It wasn't just maternal instinct, she told herself. It wasn't age or burnout or the weight of decades of grief and hope intertwined with conservation work. Something about River was different, more than different, unsettling. She began observing him from a distance, notebook in hand, scribbling. in shorthand that only she could decipher. Where Ash napped in awkward heaps, River rested with precision. Legs tucked beneath him, trunk coiled neatly, always facing the gate. When Ash startled at sudden noise, River didn't flinch. Instead, he turned toward the sound as if identifying it, processing it. On the fourth night, when the floodlights were accidentally left on, Ash blinked and fussed, but River kept his eyes wide open, unblinking, watching. One morning, Diane entered the surveillance room, a cramped trailer outfitted with motion sensor, monitors and live feeds, and asked to review footage from the previous night. Interns shifted awkwardly in their seats. "Something you looking for in particular?" one asked. "Just River," she said simply. She watched for hours. At 2:14 a.m., the camera near the feeding pen flickered briefly. Not enough to raise alarms, just a tiny glitch. But what followed made her sit forward in her chair. River rose from his mother's side and walked deliberately toward the fence. Not wandering, walking. He stopped just before the far corner, where the caretakers usually gathered during early feedings. He lifted his trunk, held it in the air, and remained still for nearly 60 seconds. Then he turned back, resettled himself, and didn't move again for the rest of the night. Diane played the footage again. And again. "Why would he do that?" she murmured. Later that day, she brought in Nia. The two women stood at the fence, watching both calves. Ash was rolling in dirt. River stood beside a water trough, his reflection distorted by the ripples. "He mimics," Diane said softly. "Not just his brother, us, our routines, our tools. He's cataloging us." Nia didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "I think he recognizes you." Diane nodded once. That evening, as the staff began their final checks before dusk, River approached the gate. Quiet, steady. As Diane stepped forward, he lifted his trunk toward her face. Not to sniff, not in aggression, but in what felt eerily like acknowledgement. And then, for the first time, he made a sound. A low, harmonic tone. Not a trumpet, not a squeak. It was soft, rhythmic, a frequency that made the hairs on Diane's neck rise. She didn't know it yet, but that sound had never been recorded in an elephant. Not anywhere. By the end of the first week, the initial thrill surrounding the twin calves began to settle into a rhythm. The reporters left, the hashtags faded, and life at Hidden Grove drifted back toward its usual pace, or so it seemed. Inside the sanctuary's lab trailer, a different kind of excitement was brewing. A graduate student named Eli, who'd volunteered to help with audio monitoring, had been analyzing the continuous acoustic recordings taken from the elephant's enclosure. Hidden Grove had long kept 24/7 ambient sound logs for research and safety purposes, mostly useful during storms or disputes between animals. But something caught Eli's attention one evening as he scrubbed through hours of uneventful hums and distant bird calls. There was a tone, low, sustained, and strangely clean, recorded just after 3 a.m. 2 nights earlier. It didn't resemble a trumpet or a rumble. It had harmonic qualities, like a chord held on an organ, faint but distinct. He isolated it, ran a spectrograph. It was unlike any known elephant vocalization. He flagged Diane the next morning. "I found something," he said, pushing a pair of headphones toward her with trembling fingers. "You need to hear this." Diane listened. At first, it sounded like static, the way deep sounds often did when stripped from background noise. But then there it was, an unmistakable tone, rising and falling like breath, measured, intentional. Her eyes met Eli's. "River, it lines up with the timestamp from his camera footage," Eli said. He was awake. He was facing the fence again. They played it over and over. It didn't matter how many times she heard it. Diane couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't just a call. It was communication, Later that day, a representative from the university arrived with more sophisticated recording tools, directional mics, sound mapping software, even an AI-assisted translator for known elephant calls. They ran River's tone through it. The system didn't spit out a match, not even a partial alignment. One of the researchers muttered under his breath, "It's like a language with no roots." Diane kept her reaction tightly reined, but inside, everything was shifting. At sunset, she returned to the enclosure. River stood at the far end again, near the same patch of fence. He was still. Ash was asleep, curled, beside Mara. But River was awake. He turned his head slowly toward Diane as she approached. Then, without moving closer, he emitted that same low tone once more. Not loud, not urgent, just deliberate. The sound passed through her, not around her, as though it wasn't meant to be heard, but felt. And for the first time since the birth, Diane wasn't just intrigued, she was afraid. When the call reached Dr. Andrew Clark, he was living alone in a converted Airstream trailer tucked behind a hardware store in northern Idaho. Once a respected wildlife biologist and behavioral theorist, Clark had vanished from academia 5 years earlier after a controversial TEDx talk in which he claimed that elephants may possess pre-linguistic cognition, not just instinctual intelligence, but intentional, structured thought. His peers had laughed, grants disappeared. He was quietly dismissed from his university post. The field labeled him eccentric, then unstable. Some even used the word delusional. So when Diane Matthews called, he almost didn't answer. But her voice, steady, direct, laced with something urgent, cut through the fog of old bitterness. "There's a calf here that's not like the others," she said. "I think it's what you were talking about all those years ago." He arrived 2 days later, scruff on his face, duffel bag over one shoulder, and eyes that scanned the sanctuary like a man returning to a battlefield. The staff was divided. Some greeted him politely, curious about the man whose name still appeared in old textbooks. Others scoffed behind clipboards, whispering that Diane had finally lost it, dragging a disgraced scientist into a place built on trust and evidence. But when Clark saw River, he didn't speak. Not at first. He crouched by the observation fence, notebook in hand, and waited for an hour. Then another. River didn't approach, didn't vocalize, just watched him, unblinking. That evening, Clark sat with Diane by the outdoor fire pit used for staff meetings and emotional decompression. The flames crackled between them as he finally said, "He's aware of me, not just seeing me, aware." Diane nodded. "I've felt that since day one." The next morning, Clark began a simple test. He approached River holding 2 differently colored flags, one red, one blue. Each time he waved the red, he stepped away. Each time he waved the blue, he dropped a treat, a piece of apple, then a frozen melon cube, then a banana. By the 6th repetition, River moved forward before the blue flag even lifted. "That's not learned behavior," Clark told the small group gathered to observe. "That's predictive cognition." Skeptics pushed back. It was coincidence. It was selective editing. It was human projection. Clark didn't argue. He simply said, "Give me 3 days." That night, alone, in the trailer where he'd set up shop, Clark reviewed audio clips. He slowed River's mysterious tone, cross-referenced it against tonal patterns in dolphin pods, whale songs, even Morse code. A stretch. But he was desperate, and just past midnight, something eerie emerged. There was a rhythm, a pause, a near symmetry. Between tones, not random, not wild. Clark played the sound once more, and this time he whispered into the dark, "He's not just calling out. He's answering." By the second week, something had changed in the air around Hidden Grove. a quiet undercurrent of tension that hummed beneath the daily routines. On the surface, things seemed normal. Volunteers washed troughs, fed the older elephants, logged the calves' sleep cycles. But the looks exchanged in the break room grew longer, quieter. Everyone was waiting, though no one could say for what. Dr. Clark's presence added fuel to the unspoken fire. Each morning, he presented new data, observations, and a quiet warning. River is responding, not just to stimuli, but to intent. He ran controlled tests, altering the order and style of interactions. The results were always the same. River adapted faster than any elephant Clark had ever studied, and then came the puzzle game, using a modified research toy typically given to great apes. A large lockbox-style contraption that required pulling levers in a specific sequence to reveal food. Clark and Diane placed the object at the far edge of the enclosure. Ash ignored it completely, too distracted by the novelty of leaves and wind. River approached. The first time he sniffed it, tapped it with his trunk, then walked away. The second time he opened the first latch. By the third attempt, River had unlocked the entire mechanism in under 5 minutes, without error, without repetition, as though he understood not just the how, but the why. Clark was stunned. "This isn't conditioning," he said flatly. "This is deduction." That night, during a video conference with researchers from the Cognitive Mammal Institute, Clark played back footage of the test. One of the senior scientists on the call interrupted halfway through. "Are you saying this elephant understands sequential logic?" "I'm saying he might," Clark replied, his voice tight. "Or something adjacent to it." The room fell silent, but the more they uncovered, the more resistance surfaced. Funding partners started calling. A quiet memo from the state wildlife board questioned the sanctuary's ethical consistency. One email accused Diane of allowing unauthorized experimentation on a protected species. Someone had started digging through old research grants. They wanted Clark off the property. Diane held the line, but she knew the clock was ticking. That evening, as thunder rolled in from the hills, Diane visited the enclosure alone. River was awake, waiting. She stood outside the gate and whispered, "Are you trying to tell us something?" And in response, clear, deliberate, came the low harmonic tone again, only this time it was followed by a second sound, shorter, sharper, a call and response, as if something or someone had answered him back. After the second tone, the sharp one that followed River's call, Diane couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her modest cabin near the west fence line, eyes fixed on the ceiling, mind reeling through possibilities. An echo, a trick of the wind, or something else entirely. She didn't mention it the next day, not to Clark, not to Naya, not even to Eli. Not until Jordan, a young volunteer who had spent most of his internship quietly feeding and cleaning behind the scenes, asked if he could speak with her privately. He seemed nervous, tapping his thumb against his palm, eyes avoiding hers. "I set up a camera," he confessed, "near the East Water Trough, just out of curiosity." Diane raised an eyebrow. "That's against protocol." "I know," Jordan said quickly, "but I kept seeing River go back to that same corner every night. I figured maybe I'd catch something weird." He handed her a small flash drive, cheeks flushed with guilt. "You need to see this." Back in the surveillance trailer, Diane plugged it in. The footage was grainy, captured by a cheap wildlife cam, the kind sold at farm supply stores. But it was clear enough. 6 a.m. River approached the fence just as he had the night before. 7 a.m. He paused, then reached his trunk through the slats. Not randomly, with purpose. He tapped the ground 3 times, waited, then came the sound, not the low tone, the sharp one, echoing faintly from somewhere deeper in the sanctuary, too distant to be Mara, too high to be mechanical. River froze, turned his head, and nodded. Diane replayed the sequence 3 times. Her stomach twisted. Clark arrived an hour later, summoned by a text that only read, "It's not just him." They watched the footage together, silent. When it ended, he whispered, "He's interacting with something we haven't identified." "Or someone," Diane added grimly. The next morning, they reviewed the sanctuary's activity logs. No staff or volunteers had been recorded near that quadrant during the night. No feeding schedules, no patrols, but someone had erased 5 minutes of surveillance footage from the internal system right after the tone occurred. It wasn't a glitch, it was deliberate. Diane stared at the blank space on the screen. Her voice was low but resolute. "Someone doesn't want us to know what River's really doing." Clark leaned back, rubbing his temple. "Then we'd better find out before they shut us down, because whatever was going on, it wasn't just about one calf anymore." The confrontation came faster than Diane expected. 3 days after discovering the missing footage, the board of Hidden Grove called an emergency meeting. It was held inside the old education barn, a room usually reserved for school visits, and donor tours now pulsing with unease. The board chair, Eleanor Price, a polished woman with sharp suits and sharper instincts, sat stiffly at the head of the table. "We've received complaints," she began. Her voice clipped. "From multiple sources." "Complaints?" Diane asked, though she already knew, about unauthorized research, about bringing in a discredited scientist, about placing the sanctuary's reputation and future funding at risk. Clark, seated beside Diane, said nothing. His jaw tightened. Eleanor turned her gaze on him. "Dr. Clark, are you or are you not conducting cognitive experiments on a federally protected animal?" Clark didn't flinch. "I'm observing." "You're manipulating behavior," another board member snapped. "Puzzle boxes? Color-coded. Flags? Sound tests." "It's not manipulation," Diane cut in. "It's interaction. And it's yielding something extraordinary." Eleanor's expression didn't budge. "You brought him in without board approval. You've gone off protocol. And now you're dragging this sanctuary into conspiracy theories." Clark leaned forward, voice measured. "This calf is doing things no elephant should be capable of. Ignoring it isn't science, it's fear." The room fell into heavy silence. When Diane returned to her office later that afternoon, the locks had been changed, her credentials revoked, Clark's access pass deactivated. They were officially shut, out, but they weren't done. That evening, Nia met them in the parking lot with a small envelope. Inside were copies of time-stamped logs, employee swipe records, and a flash drive containing the unedited camera feed from the night of the second tone. "There's something else," Nia said. "A sensor picked up movement along the outer fence during that missing window. No animal, no scheduled patrols." Diane stared at the data. Someone had been there, not just deleting footage, visiting River in the dead of night. "Why cover it up?" she asked aloud. "Why erase proof of something this monumental?" Clark didn't answer, not right away. Then he said, "Because maybe River isn't just exceptional. Maybe he's inconvenient." The implications were enormous. If River's cognition could be proven, not just intelligence but conscious awareness, it would force a rethinking of animal rights, captivity laws, even the ethics of conservation itself. And someone, somewhere, was willing to bury that truth. But the story wasn't over, because in the latest footage, buried deep in the encrypted drive Nia had slipped them, was a final clip. River, alone, turning to the camera and making a new sound. Not a tone, a pattern, 3 short bursts, a pause, then 3 more. It wasn't random, it was structure, language, a code. And Diane knew with the kind of certainty that burns into bone, River was trying to speak, the sanctuary. And board tried to spin the shutdown as a routine research pause. Press inquiries were deflected. River and Ash were moved to a restricted section of the preserve under tighter surveillance. Public access was cut off. But the story had already escaped the fence. A junior technician at the university leaked River's vocal patterns online, accompanied by spectrograph overlays and Clark's annotations. The post went viral within hours. Thousands of comments flooded in: linguists, musicians, AI experts, lay people with theories. They all had one reaction: this wasn't just sound, it was intentional. Within a week, River's pattern had been analyzed by a retired NASA communications engineer who noted its structural similarity to early binary signaling protocols, not in content, but in format, rhythm, deliberate sequencing, and attempt, crude but deliberate, at two-way communication. Under mounting pressure, the board was forced to allow one final review. A single day, one camera, no interference. Diane and Clark were invited back. They didn't speak as they walked the familiar path. The silence between them wasn't tense, it was reverent. Something sacred had taken root, and they were about to face it. River stood alone in the enclosure. Mara rested beside Ash in the shade. As Diane approached the fence, River lifted. His head, his eyes met hers. No fear, no confusion, recognition. Diane didn't speak. She simply stood there, arms crossed over the gate, watching, and River began. First, the same three-note tone, then a pause, then another variation, slightly altered, then silence. For 10 full seconds, nothing moved, not the trees, not the wind. And then Diane stepped forward and tapped her hand once, twice, 3 times on the metal railing. River responded immediately, not just with sound. He moved his foot in rhythm with her taps, a physical mirror of what she'd just done. The camera caught everything, and when it aired, first on a late-night science show, then syndicated across major networks, it shattered the boundary between belief and fact. River wasn't mimicking, he was replying. The debate that followed was chaotic. Accusations, peer reviews, ethical think pieces. But buried beneath the noise was something gentler, something powerful. A quiet shift in the way millions looked at animals, at intelligence, at connection. River remained at Hidden Grove. The board backed down. Funding tripled. A new center was established, not for entertainment, not for tourism, but for interspecies communication research. Diane visited every morning. She never brought a notepad again. She just stood there. Sometimes she tapped the fence. Sometimes River tapped back. And sometimes, in the perfect hush of dawn, they said nothing at all. Because some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your voice too. Where are you watching from? And what moment stayed with you the most? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and your thoughts mean the world.